I still remember the exact moment I first noticed the shift. It was subtle, like a draft that sneaks through a closed window, barely perceptible, but once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. Elaine's voice had that tone again, polite, lilting, and yet sharpened at the edges. "Daniel, did you notice your mother's been repeating herself lately?" she asked me, smiling at me across the dinner table, as if it were an innocent observation. "It's probably nothing. Maybe she's just tired." I looked up from my cup of tea. Her words hung in the air like the faint scent of smoke after a candle's been blown out. Harmless on the surface, but warning of something deeper. Daniel, my son, didn't look at me. He just gave a small, distracted shrug. "She's been busy. Mom's always juggling a dozen things at once." Elaine smiled again. That smile I used to think was beautiful before I learned how well she used it to hide her intent. "Oh, I know. I worry about her." That was the first spark, the whisper of doubt. And it wouldn't be the last. Our Sunday dinners had become a ritual since my husband passed away. I always cooked lamb roast, rosemary potatoes, sometimes the old-fashioned apple crumble Daniel loved as a boy. I enjoyed the noise, the warmth, the laughter. It made the empty house feel alive again. But ever since Elaine had joined our family, that laughter had grown thinner. There were pauses now, invisible walls between words. She spoke as though she were performing, not conversing. Every gesture seemed rehearsed. And Daniel, my sweet, thoughtful Daniel, had begun to shrink inside himself. He was polite, of course, he always was, but he'd started glancing at her before answering me, like a boy checking with his teacher before speaking out of turn. It broke my heart, though I said nothing. I've lived long enough to know that the surest way to lose your son is to criticize his wife. So I smiled and listened and waited. Later that evening, when they'd gone home, I found the sugar bowl missing from the counter. Odd, I thought. I had just used it. I checked the pantry, the table, even the refrigerator. No sugar bowl. I laughed softly at myself. "Maybe I am getting forgetful," I murmured. But the next morning, I found it. In the laundry room, half full, sitting neatly beside the detergent. That was not forgetfulness. That was placement. And I began to understand that what was happening was no accident. Over the next few weeks, Elaine's concern grew. "Mom," she would say sweetly, "you called Daniel twice this morning. You must have forgotten." Or, "Mom, you left the oven on again. I found it when I stopped by." Or my favorite, "You mixed up your medication bottles. That can be dangerous at your age." Each time, she'd glance at Daniel, feigning gentle worry. And each time, I'd see his jaw tighten. Not in anger, but in quiet, creeping fear. That was how she worked. Not with shouting, not with open cruelty, but with whispers. The kind that erode trust grain by grain until the foundation itself begins to crumble. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, Daniel walked me to the car. He hesitated before speaking. "Mom, you'd tell me if you weren't feeling well, right?" I smiled, though my heart sank. "Of course, darling. Why?" He looked down. "Elaine's just worried about you. You've seemed distracted lately. Forgetful." Forgetful. The word landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading through everything I thought I knew. I rested my hand on his arm. "Daniel, do I seem forgetful to you?" He hesitated. "Too long." "No, Mom, you don't," he said finally, forcing a small smile. "No, you don't." But I saw the flicker in his eyes. The seed had already been planted. In the weeks that followed, the house began to betray me. Keys disappeared. Emails I didn't remember sending appeared in my inbox. A checkbook I had locked away somehow found its way to the living room floor. And Elaine, always helpful, always cheerful, was the one to find them. "Oh, Margaret, look! You must have dropped it." Or, "I found this under your couch cushion. You probably just forgot you put it there." Every line rehearsed, every gesture innocent. But I recognized the rhythm of manipulation. My late husband was a lawyer. I'd seen enough deceit to recognize its scent. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was framing. One evening, I invited them both for tea again. This time, I made sure to serve everything perfectly. The table set with lace, the tea poured at just the right temperature. Elaine chatted pleasantly, her charm effortless. Daniel smiled, though distracted. Then she said it. "Mom, I was talking to a friend whose mother recently moved into this wonderful assisted living community. They have doctors on site, personal chefs, a beautiful garden." I cut her off gently. "Elaine," I said, keeping my tone kind, "are you suggesting I move into a nursing home?" Her eyes widened, feigning surprise. "Oh, no, of course not. I just thought, since you're alone so often, it might be comforting for all of us." Daniel shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. "It's just a suggestion, Mom," he murmured. I smiled. "I appreciate the concern." But then I looked directly at Elaine. "But I'm quite comfortable here. Thank you." Our eyes met. Hers warm on the surface, ice cold beneath. For the first time, I saw the real expression behind her smile. Calculation. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk with a single lamp burning, going over the family trust papers, the property deeds, and the accounts Daniel would inherit someday. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything my husband and I had built. Every sacrifice, every late night, every decision made for our family's future. And I realized something chilling. Elaine wasn't just after comfort. She was after control. The next morning, I made a phone call to Mr. Harris, our family lawyer. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm with recognition, "it's been a while. How are you holding up?" "I'm well," I replied calmly, "but I believe I may need your help soon." "Of course. What's the matter?" "Let's just say," I said quietly, "my daughter-in-law is showing too much interest in my well-being." There was a pause. Then his voice softened. "Tell me everything." And I did. Not with fear, but with precision. For the next few days, I began to play my part. I allowed small mistakes to seem believable. I forgot my scarf at their house. I misplaced a bill payment. Each time I watched her eyes light up. The thrill of progress. Let her think she was winning. Meanwhile, Mr. Harris began collecting everything. Documents, dates, small audio notes I recorded on my phone whenever she made her subtle remarks. He arranged discreet evaluations from my real doctor, proving my mental clarity beyond doubt. And he advised me to do what I'd always been best at: observe. The following Sunday, Elaine arrived early for dinner. Too early. She moved around my kitchen as if she owned it, humming softly, rearranging things for convenience. "You know, Margaret," she said with that sugary voice, "Daniel and I have been talking about helping you simplify your finances. It must be such a burden to manage everything yourself." "Oh, it's not a burden at all," I replied evenly. "I've always handled it." She smiled. "Yes, but things can slip through the cracks at your age. You wouldn't want a mix-up." I looked at her carefully. "A mix-up?" She held my gaze. "A misplaced signature, a forgotten payment, a missed document. It happens." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'm sure it does," I said, "especially when people forget who they're dealing with." She froze, just for a heartbeat. Then she laughed lightly. "You're funny, Margaret." That night, I sat alone by the fire, tea cooling beside me. I stared into the flames and felt the quiet steel of resolve take root in my chest. She thought she was clever. She thought she could break me slowly, one whisper at a time. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that every whisper left a trace. Every manipulation, every lie, every misplaced object was a breadcrumb leading straight back to her. And I was following them one by one. The days following Grace's move into the small garden suite felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that hums beneath the surface. Polite, restrained, but heavy with unspoken tension. Evelyn would often pass by with a rehearsed smile, a steaming cup of tea in hand. "Chamomile, Grace. It helps you relax," she'd say sweetly. But Grace noticed how her daughter-in-law never actually waited for her to drink it. She'd leave the cup on the table and disappear into the hallway with that polished click of heels, always before a conversation could go deeper. It wasn't hostility, not overtly. It was control disguised as care. Grace began keeping a notebook, something she hadn't done since her teaching days. She wrote down small things, how Evelyn repeated certain words, how she often mentioned responsibility and safety in the same sentence, how she referred to the family trust as the burden I'll have to manage someday. The pattern was emerging, subtle, but unmistakable. One evening, the three of them sat together at the long oak dining table. The golden chandelier light cast warm tones across porcelain plates and cutlery, so perfectly arranged it almost looked staged. Evelyn was pouring wine, laughing about something that hadn't been funny. Grace took a slow sip, studying her daughter-in-law's every movement. Her nails, crimson, manicured to perfection, tapped gently against the glass. That rhythm again, always tapping when she was trying to manipulate the conversation. "Henry," Evelyn began lightly, "I've been thinking. Your mom's memory seems a bit scattered lately, don't you think? I mean, she forgot her bank appointment last week." Henry's fork froze in midair. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice stayed calm. "I rescheduled it because I had a doctor's appointment, dear. I told you that." Evelyn laughed softly, the kind of laugh that brushed away explanations. Of course. I just worry, that's all. You're always juggling so much, Grace." Henry smiled awkwardly, torn between love and unease. Maybe Mom does need more rest. You've been tired, haven't you?" Grace held his gaze. Her heart sank slightly, not from offense, but from realization. Evelyn was testing boundaries, testing how far she could stretch perception before it snapped. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by her small writing desk, the lamplight illuminating her trembling hands. "She's setting the stage, Grace. Brick by brick, she's building the story she'll tell about the old woman losing her mind. Grace opened her notebook again and began a new page. Stage 1. Undermining. She listed each tactic Evelyn had used. False concern, subtle correction, selective storytelling. She didn't just feel betrayed, she felt intellectually provoked, as if she were playing chess against an opponent who underestimated her. If she wants to play games, Grace murmured under her breath, then we'll play. But I've been teaching longer than she's been breathing. A few days later, Evelyn invited a home care specialist to evaluate Grace's living arrangements. She presented it as a kind gesture, a safety check for the elderly. Grace greeted the specialist with warmth and charm. "Welcome, dear," she said, motioning to the tea set. "Evelyn told me you wanted to see my space. You'll find I'm quite independent." The specialist, a polite young woman named Mia, smiled and began her checklist. But it quickly became apparent that Grace was not what Evelyn had described. She spoke clearly, remembered dates with precision, and even corrected a few of Mia's notes with humor and wit. Mia left with an apologetic glance toward Evelyn. Later that evening, Grace overheard a whispered argument from the living room. "Evelyn, you made me look foolish. She's sharper than you said." "Henry, Evelyn, she's my mother. You can't expect her to just fade because you want it convenient." "Evelyn, that's not what I said. I'm trying to protect her and us. She's old, Henry. One fall, one mistake, and it'll all be on us." Grace smiled faintly in the dark hallway. There it is again, protection as control. Henry began to notice things too. The way Evelyn's tone changed when she spoke about his mother, the unnecessary sighs, the performative worry. One morning, he found Grace in the garden trimming her roses, a habit she'd kept since her late husband passed. "Mom," he said softly, "Evelyn told me you forgot to pay the phone bill last month." Grace looked up. "Did she now? Then it's a miracle the phone still works." She handed him a neatly folded receipt. "Paid in full, on time." Henry left quietly, but unease flickered behind his smile. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have known." "Don't apologize, darling," Grace replied gently. "Sometimes people see what they want to see." Her tone wasn't bitter, it was knowing, wise, and Henry felt it. Something in him began to shift. Realizing her first attempt failed, Evelyn changed tactics. If she couldn't make Grace look incompetent, she'd make her look unstable. She began moving objects, small things like Grace's reading glasses, her medication, or her favorite brooch. Then she'd find them in odd places and feign concern. "Oh dear, Grace, you put your glasses in the fridge again. You should really be careful." But Grace was already documenting everything. Each manipulation, each misplaced item, and even discreetly recorded a few conversations. And she wasn't just collecting, she was planning. One afternoon, Grace visited her lawyer, a man named Richard, old friend of her late husband. She brought her notebook, evidence, and one very specific request. "I want to update my will," she said calmly. "But more than that, I want to prepare contingencies." Richard frowned slightly. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Grace?" She smiled, her expression calm but sharp. "Let's just say I'd like to make sure that when the vultures circle, they find nothing but their own reflections." He nodded slowly, understanding. "You always were the clever one." "And Evelyn," Grace said with a small, ironic smile, "never liked puzzles she couldn't solve." That night, Evelyn poured another cup of tea, her voice dripping with false affection. You know, Grace, sometimes I think it would be better if you lived somewhere with more help. You'd have nurses, company, structure. Grace took a long sip of the tea, untouched by fear, her eyes steady. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, "the only structure I need is the one I've already built." Evelyn smiled, oblivious to the layers behind the words. Grace knew the battle had only begun, but she also knew one thing for certain. Evelyn was playing checkers. Grace was playing chess. The morning sun spilled through the garden windows, golden and soft, painting the tablecloth in gentle light. Grace sat with her notebook open, pages filled with neat handwriting. Dates, times, patterns. Every move Evelyn had made was cataloged like evidence in a trial. Outside, the air carried the faint hum of the neighborhood, dogs barking, a lawnmower in the distance. But inside, the house felt staged, every smile rehearsed, every conversation laced with hidden motives. Grace wasn't angry anymore. Anger clouds judgment, and judgment, she knew, was her greatest weapon. Evelyn called for a family breakfast that Sunday, a rare gesture. She'd arranged everything meticulously. Fresh croissants, fruit bowls, the aroma of coffee filling the air. Grace entered the kitchen and noticed two strangers seated at the table. They wore professional attire, crisp and neutral, the kind of people who introduce themselves with business cards. "Grace," Evelyn said brightly, "these are Dr. Lynn and Ms. Torres. They specialize in geriatric care. I thought they could chat with you, just routine, you know?" Grace's eyes flickered briefly to Henry, who looked uncomfortable. He hadn't been told. "Routine," Grace echoed softly, taking her seat. "How thoughtful of you." Dr. Lynn smiled politely. "Mrs. Avery, Evelyn tells us you've been having some trouble with memory and organization. Would you say that's true?" Grace's expression was calm. "Trouble remembering? No. Though I must admit I've been quite forgetful about one thing. The date of your appointment. Evelyn didn't tell me you'd be joining us." The doctor blinked, glancing awkwardly at Evelyn. "Ah, it was a bit last minute." Grace smiled thinly. "Ah, yes. Spontaneity. A rare thing for people who care for others' minds." The tension was palpable. Evelyn's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Henry said carefully, "Mom, they're just here to make sure you're okay." Grace turned to him gently. "Darling, I've been okay for 70 years, but thank you for worrying." The doctor cleared his throat, fumbling for professionalism. "Well, Mrs. Avery, perhaps we could speak privately for a few minutes?" Grace's gaze didn't waver. "Of course." She stood up and gestured toward her sitting room. But as she passed Evelyn, she leaned in just enough to whisper, her voice smooth as silk. "Next time you invite guests to question me, make sure they know who truly runs this household." Evelyn stiffened, her composure cracking for a fraction of a second. In the sitting room, the doctor began his evaluation gently. "Can you tell me today's date?" Grace smiled. "October 14th, 2025. The day my daughter-in-law overreached her ambitions." He paused. "Excuse me?" "Nothing, dear. Please continue." He asked about medications, about her routine, about her finances, each question revealing how much Evelyn had told him. When he finished, he sat back, thoughtful. "Mrs. Avery, if I may say so, you're remarkably lucid. Sharp, even." Grace chuckled. "You sound surprised." He smiled awkwardly. Evelyn seemed genuinely concerned. "She often is," Grace said smoothly, "especially when she has something to gain." He blinked. "I see." "Do you?" Grace's tone softened. "Because what you're witnessing is not care. It's orchestration. I'd suggest you make note of that in your report." Dr. Lynn nodded slowly, understanding dawning. That evening, Grace found Evelyn pacing in the kitchen. "So," Evelyn said curtly, "you charmed the doctor. Congratulations." Grace's tone was light. "I merely answered his questions." Evelyn slammed a glass onto the counter. "You're playing games, Grace. I'm trying to help you." "Help me?" Grace repeated, her eyes sharp now. "By bringing strangers into my home to test my sanity?" Evelyn turned away, voice trembling with controlled fury. "You're being paranoid. Maybe that's part of the problem." Grace stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Careful, Evelyn. Paranoia is when you imagine enemies. I don't have to imagine you." Their eyes met, one pair burning, the other utterly calm. It was the first time Evelyn realized she was outmatched. Grace spent the next few days in quiet preparation. She called her lawyer again. They met in his office, a space filled with leather-bound books, the scent of old wood, and the faint ticking of a clock. "Richard," Grace began, placing her notebook on the desk, "I want to formalize my observations. Everything Evelyn has done, I've documented, but I want something more." He leaned forward. "What's your plan?" She smiled faintly. "Let's just say I'd like her to reveal herself. Legally." Richard understood. "You want to trigger her overconfidence." "Exactly. People like Evelyn can't resist feeling superior." A few days later, Grace began acting subtly forgetful. She left her checkbook out, misplaced her purse intentionally, and asked Evelyn to help with minor decisions. Evelyn took the bait instantly. She grew bolder, more careless, making calls on Grace's behalf, intercepting her mail, even whispering to Henry about next steps. But what Evelyn didn't know was that every call, every conversation, every message was being quietly monitored by Richard's firm, with Grace's consent. The trap was no longer forming. It was set. The night was heavy with the scent of rain. The family sat down to dinner once more. Evelyn was radiant, confident, the queen of her domain. Henry, however, seemed distant, quiet. He'd begun to see through her charm. "Henry," said Evelyn sweetly, "I think it's time we discuss the nursing home again. Grace needs structure, supervision." Grace interrupted softly. "Funny, you keep using that word. Structure. Do you know what I've always loved about structures, Evelyn?" Evelyn frowned. "What?" "They collapse beautifully when the foundation is rotten." And then, as if on cue, Grace turned toward Henry. "Darling, would you please open the drawer by the sideboard? There's something I'd like you to see." Inside was a neatly bound folder. Transcripts of Evelyn's calls to Dr. Lynn, copies of Ford's signatures, and even a voicemail she'd left for the lawyer's assistant trying to access the trust documents. Evelyn's face went pale. Henry's voice was low, trembling. "Evelyn, what is this?" Grace remained seated, composed. "Proof," she said. "Proof of what happens when greed mistakes itself for intelligence." Evelyn stammered, This isn't what it looks like." But Henry wasn't listening anymore. The mask had fallen, and in that silence, the long, devastating silence, Evelyn realized she had lost everything. Evelyn left the table shaking. Henry sat there for a long while, staring at the evidence before him. His heart was breaking, not for Evelyn, but for his blindness. "Mom," he whispered finally, "how long have you known?" Grace smiled sadly. "Since the day she offered me tea I didn't ask for." Henry laughed weakly, tears in his eyes. "You're incredible." "I'm old, Henry," she said gently. "Not stupid. Never forget that difference." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I won't." Outside, rain began to fall, steady, cleansing, rhythmic. Inside, the air felt lighter. The storm had passed, but its lessons would linger. But Evelyn wasn't finished yet. A week later, she tried one last act of desperation, filing a report claiming Grace was mentally unfit to manage her assets. Unfortunately for her, that report went directly to Richard's office, which had already preemptively filed a legal protection document verifying Grace's sound mind, complete with the psychologist's evaluation from Dr. Lynn, the very doctor Evelyn had brought in. Grace had anticipated it all. Evelyn's claim was dismissed immediately. Her reputation, however, suffered irreparable damage. Grace sat once more in her garden, trimming her roses. The sun was gentle, the petals soft and bright against her hands. Henry approached quietly, a faint smile on his lips. "She's moving out," he said softly. Grace nodded. "I expected as much." "You planned every bit of this, didn't you?" Grace chuckled softly. "I just let people show who they truly are, Henry. That's all the planning I ever needed." He sat beside her, the silence now peaceful. "I'll never doubt you again." She smiled. "Good. Because a mother's mind isn't something you measure by her years, but what she survives." The house felt different after Evelyn left. Not quieter, just lighter, as if a thick fog had lifted. But Grace knew storms often returned for one last roar before fading completely. And Evelyn was nothing if not persistent. Grace stood in her kitchen, the scent of coffee mingling with sunlight. The walls, once filled with tension, seemed to breathe again. She looked at her reflection in the kettle, the faint lines around her eyes, the steady focus that had carried her through decades of life, loss, and love. She thought of her late husband, William. His favorite saying had always been, "Never fight noise with noise, Grace. Let silence do the talking." And so, she decided silence would be her greatest weapon. She called Mr. Harris, her lawyer, once more, her tone calm but purposeful. "Richard," she said, "I'd like to make my intentions clear. Evelyn may have left this house, but she's not finished. She'll come for the money next. Let's make sure she finds an empty vault." Richard chuckled softly on the other end. "You mean transfer the trust?" "Not just transfer it," Grace said. "Redefine it." That afternoon, she arrived at Harris & Co., her silk scarf tied neatly around her shoulders. The office was lined with law books, and the faint smell of old paper carried an air of authority. Richard gestured for her to sit. "You've always been 2 steps ahead, Grace. What's the next move?" Grace smiled. "My son has a kind heart. It blinds him sometimes. I want his inheritance protected, but in a way that teaches him to protect it himself." "Go on." "I'd like the family trust rewritten," she said. "Every major withdrawal must go through dual approval, Daniel and myself. Should anything happen to me, it passes to Daniel directly, but with a conditional clause. It cannot be accessed by his spouse unless proven to be in a stable marriage of at least 5 years, approved by the board. Richard leaned back, impressed. You thought this through. Grace's gaze was steady. I've lived through people like Evelyn before. They all believe the same thing, that kindness is weakness. It isn't. She signed the papers with a slow, elegant hand. The sound of pen against parchment felt final, like a chapter closing. 3 weeks later, Evelyn returned. She didn't knock. She never did. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor as she entered, face painted with false remorse. Grace, she began, her tone soft, almost pleading, I came to apologize. Things got out of hand. Grace looked up from her chair, teacup poised. Did they? Evelyn exhaled dramatically. I was under stress. You know how hard it is managing everything. The house, Daniel's work, your health. My health seems fine, replied evenly. Better, in fact, since you left. Evelyn forced a laugh. You're still sharp as ever. Grace smiled. Sharper, I'd say. Evelyn's eyes darted around the room. Look, I just want to make things right. For Daniel's sake. Grace nodded slowly. Then you'll understand why honesty matters. Evelyn tilted her head. What do you mean? Grace gestured toward the envelope on the table. Your request for asset transfer, dated before the evaluation. Evelyn froze. Grace continued gently. You wanted control, Evelyn, and for a moment I almost pitied you, but then I remembered pity is wasted on those who mistake cruelty for cleverness. Evelyn's facade cracked. You can't prove. I don't need to, Grace interrupted softly, because you already did. Her phone buzzed on cue. Mr. Harris's name appeared on the screen. Grace answered it slowly. Yes, Richard. Oh, you've confirmed the date? Excellent. Yes, Evelyn's here with me now. She'll be delighted to know the trust has been legally sealed. Evelyn's face drained of color. Sealed? She stammered. Grace hung up, her smile gentle but cold. Yes, you see. The more you tried to take, the more I realized I hadn't protected what mattered. Now I have. Evelyn took a trembling step back. You can't do this! I already did. Her tone was soft, but her gaze was steel. You see, Evelyn, the difference between you and me is simple. You play games to win power. I play games to protect love. That evening, Daniel arrived home early. Grace invited him for tea, as she always did. Mom, he began hesitantly, Evelyn came to see me. She said you're trying to turn me against her. Grace stirred her tea, calm as ever. And what did you tell her? That I didn't know what to believe. Grace smiled faintly. Then it's time I show you. She led him to her study, a small, quiet room lined with photographs, letters, and a box labeled, For Daniel, when the truth matters. Inside were printouts, call transcripts, copies of Evelyn's attempts to forge authorizations. Daniel's hands trembled as he sifted through them. His voice broke. How long has this been going on? Grace rested a hand on his arm. Long enough for me to understand something important. You didn't fail me by not seeing it, Daniel. You only failed yourself by not listening to your instincts. He sat down heavily, face buried in his hands. I thought she loved me. She loved what you could offer. Love that demands blindness isn't love, darling. It's control." He looked up, tears in his eyes. "What do I do now?" "You rebuild," she said simply. "Not for me, for you." 2 nights later, Evelyn tried again. This time, she cornered Daniel in their kitchen, voice trembling between guilt and manipulation. "She's turning you against me," she cried. "Don't you see? Your mother's controlling everything." Daniel stood still. The old Daniel might have wavered, but now? Now he had clarity. "I see a lot more than you think," he said quietly, "and I think it's time you left." Evelyn's face twisted. "You'll regret this." "No," he said. "I regret not seeing it sooner." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence afterward was almost sacred, the sound of truth settling where deceit once lived. A week later, Grace met Richard one last time. He handed her the finalized documents. The trust secured, her son's finances protected, Evelyn legally excluded from all family holdings. "Everything's in place," he said with a smile. "You've outplayed her completely." Grace nodded. "It was never about winning, Richard. It was about peace." He regarded her with quiet admiration. "You remind me of your husband, strategic, graceful, patient." She smiled softly. "He taught me well." As she left the office, she paused by the door, looking out at the golden light spilling over the city. There was no triumph in her heart, only relief, and a sense of restored balance. That evening, Daniel joined her on the porch. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and amber, the kind of sunset that makes you believe in renewal. "He ended things with her," he said quietly. "I know. She tried to call you names, twist the story, but it didn't work. I saw who she really was." Grace smiled gently. "That's all I ever wanted, Daniel. For you to see." He looked at her, eyes full of remorse. "You must think I'm foolish." "No," she said softly. "Just human." He leaned back, exhaling deeply. "You saved me, Mom." She reached out, squeezing his hand. "No, darling, I just reminded you who you are." They sat in silence as the sun sank lower. For the first time in months, the world around them felt safe again. And in that stillness, Grace whispered a silent promise to herself, never to let fear or manipulation dim the truth again. The following weeks were a quiet, deliberate performance, one I had been preparing for years without even realizing it. When you grow older, people assume your memory fades, your mind slows, your grip on reality weakens. They don't realize that you've simply learned the art of watching, of collecting small truths hidden between words. Lydia's plan was still unfolding. She had started inviting professionals into the house. Therapists, estate advisors, even a notary. Each visit was cloaked in concern. "Mother, I just want to make sure everything is organized for your future," she'd say in that falsely gentle tone. Nathan was uneasy, but said little. His trust in his wife was deeply ingrained, but so was his love for me. That conflict kept him quiet. For now. One morning, Lydia announced, "Mother, a doctor will come today for a routine checkup, just to ensure you're in good health." I looked up from my teacup and smiled faintly. "Oh, that's thoughtful. What kind of doctor?" She hesitated. "Too long." "A neurologist," she finally said. "You know, just a basic cognitive assessment. Nothing to worry about." "Cognitive," I repeated softly. "You think I've forgotten how to think?" She flinched. "Of course not. It's just—" "Good," I interrupted. standing slowly but firmly. "Then I'll be happy to take the test." Inside, my pulse was calm. I knew exactly what she was attempting, and I had already prepared for it. The doctor, a man in his late 30s named Dr. Reeves, arrived that afternoon. His eyes were kind, but wary. The eyes of someone who had been paid to deliver a conclusion rather than seek a truth. "Mrs. Alden," he began politely, setting his bag on the coffee table, "Lydia tells me you've been feeling a little forgetful lately." I smiled. "Does she now? How interesting. What exactly did I forget, doctor?" He hesitated. Lydia stood behind him, hands folded, pretending to be nervous and compassionate. "Well," Dr. Reeves said slowly, "she mentioned you sometimes forget where you've placed things or lose track of conversations." I mumbled. "I suppose that's common for someone in their 70s. But tell me, doctor, do you ever misplace your car keys?" He blinked, surprised. "Well, occasionally, yes. Should I call a neurologist for you, then?" I asked, smiling pleasantly. He chuckled awkwardly. Lydia's jaw tightened. I leaned forward slightly. "Let's do the test, shall we? I've always loved games of memory." He began the assessment. Simple arithmetic, short-term recall, pattern recognition. I answered everything calmly, sometimes embellishing my replies with small jokes that made the doctor laugh. By the time he left, Lydia's carefully built facade had begun to crack. "She's sharp as ever," Dr. Reeves said with a faint smile. "Frankly, Lydia, I think your mother-in-law could outsmart most of my colleagues." The moment the door closed, Lydia's expression hardened like glass. "Why are you doing this?" I asked mildly. "Doing what? Answering questions truthfully?" She glared at me, then turned away, but I saw it, the tremor in her hands, the quiet panic beneath her anger. She knew the tide was turning. That evening, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time, James Turner, my old lawyer and trusted friend. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rich with warmth, "it's been ages. What can I do for you?" "James," I said calmly, "I believe my daughter-in-law is attempting to have me declared mentally unfit. I'd like you to prepare a few things." A pause. Then a soft sigh. "I was afraid you'd say something like that. Tell me everything." For the next hour, I outlined every detail. The financial movements, the subtle manipulations, the false concern. James took notes in silence. When I finished, he said, "I'll come by tomorrow, quietly. We'll make sure you're protected, Eleanor. Every document, every account, every right. Secured." "Thank you, James," I said. "But I'd like one more thing." "Yes?" "I want you to listen," I said. "Literally. Tomorrow, I'll have you hidden in the study when Lydia brings up the subject again. She won't know you're there. I want her words, her intent, on record." James chuckled softly. "You're still the sharpest woman I know." "I'm just an old mother," I said with a faint smile. "One who listens." The next afternoon, Lydia returned with papers, legal documents masked as organizational forms. "Mother," she began sweetly, "these are just for your peace of mind. They'll ensure that if something ever happens to you, we can manage the estate properly." I looked down at the stack, at least 30 pages thick. "You've been busy." "I just want to help," she said. "Of course you do," I murmured. "Shall we review them together?" As I led her to the study, my heart was steady. James was already there, hidden behind the half-open bookshelf panel, recorder ready. Lydia began reading through the papers with her rehearsed calm, her tone smooth and honeyed. But the words betrayed her. Transfer of financial authority, medical consent, power of attorney. When she paused, I looked up quietly. "And what happens if I refuse, Lydia?" Her voice changed, the softness thinning to a steel edge. "Then I'll have no choice but to act in your best interest anyway, Mother. Nathan may be too emotional to see it, but I'm not. I know what's best for this family." "Oh," I asked softly, "and what's that?" "To prevent a confused old woman from ruining her own legacy," she snapped, and then immediately forced a smile back onto her face. I leaned back in my chair. "I see. And tell me, Lydia, what would that legacy be worth in dollars?" Her eyes flickered. The briefest tell, but enough. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. You've already moved money around, haven't you? Testing the boundaries. But there's one thing you miscalculated." "What's that?" she said through gritted teeth. "The old woman," I replied, smiling faintly. "She was never confused." At that moment, the door to the study opened. James stepped out, recorder in hand. Lydia went pale. What is this?" "Legal protection," James said calmly. "For my client." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. The kind of silence that ends a war. Lydia's lips trembled, but no words came out. She turned sharply and stormed out of the room. James placed the recorder on the desk. "That's everything we need." I nodded, the faintest ache rising in my chest. "I didn't want it to come to this," I whispered. "Eleanor," James said softly, "you didn't start this. You just finished it." That night, as rain pattered against the window, I sat alone by the fireplace. The house felt both heavier and lighter, filled with echoes of betrayal, but also with peace. Nathan hadn't yet learned the truth. That would come in time. For now, I let the quiet comfort me. Lydia thought she could corner me, declare me unfit, erase my will. But she had underestimated one simple truth. Mothers don't fade. We adapt. And I wasn't done yet. The following morning dawned cold and gray, a perfect reflection of the silence that had settled over the house. Lydia didn't join us for breakfast. Her seat at the table sat untouched, the porcelain cup beside it empty. Nathan noticed, his brows furrowing. "Where's Lydia?" he asked. "Probably upstairs," I said, stirring my tea. "She was tired last night." He nodded slowly, uncertain. There was a nervous energy about him, as if some instinct deep within had begun to stir, something his heart had known, but his mind refused to see. I let the silence linger. Some truths can't be told. They must be discovered. By noon, James had sent me a message. "Everything's in motion. I'll deliver the evidence to Nathan directly." I hesitated before replying. There was part of me, the mother, that wanted to protect my son from the pain that truth brings. But there was another part, the woman, who knew pain is sometimes the only teacher that leaves a lasting mark. I texted back, "Do it." Nathan came home early that day. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room, a folder clutched in his hand. "Mother," he said quietly, "is this true?" I didn't answer right away. I simply looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the storm behind his eyes. He dropped the folder on the coffee table. Papers spilled out, transcripts of the recording, financial records, copies of the forged legal documents Lydia had prepared. She tried to have you declared incompetent, and she wanted to take control of the trust? "Yes," I said softly. Nathan sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "God, I can't believe it." I reached over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You can, you just don't want to." He looked up at me, guilt written all over him. "I didn't see it. I thought she was just trying to help. I kept telling myself you were imagining things. You saw what you wanted to see, I said gently. We all do when we love someone. He nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. What do I do now? You do nothing rash, I said firmly. She'll reveal herself. People like her always do when cornered. And right on cue, Lydia came down the stairs. Her eyes were red, but there was no remorse, only fury barely disguised as pain. Nathan, she began, her voice trembling. Your mother has been lying to you. She's turning you against me. Nathan stood, his tone calm but razor sharp. Is that so? Because I've read the documents you prepared, the ones giving you full control over her estate. Lydia froze. Nathan, I was only trying to protect the family. By declaring my mother mentally unfit? She's been confused, forgetful. Stop, he snapped. Just stop lying. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. You came into this family with charm, but every smile had a motive. Every act of kindness was calculated. And I let it happen because I wanted to believe you loved us. Lydia's mask cracked. You're choosing her over me? I'm choosing the truth, he said simply. Her composure shattered. You think you've won. You're an old woman, Eleanor. You don't have forever. I smiled faintly. No, but I have enough. Lydia left that afternoon, slamming the doors so hard it rattled the china cabinet. Nathan stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the driveway. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was small, almost childlike. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because, I said softly, you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to see it for yourself. Love has a way of blinding even the wisest hearts. He sat down beside me, his hand covering mine. I'm so sorry, Mother. There's nothing to be sorry for, I replied. You've learned. That's what matters. But she could have ruined everything, he said bitterly. She could have tried, I said, my eyes on the fire. But I didn't survive 7 decades by being naive. That night, the house felt different. Lighter, freer. The tension that had once filled the air like smoke had finally dissipated. Nathan called his lawyer the next morning. The divorce proceedings began quietly, efficiently. Lydia didn't contest them. Perhaps she realized there was no way to win once the truth was out. But I wasn't interested in her downfall. What mattered to me was what grew in its place. A stronger bond between mother and son, rebuilt on trust and understanding. Weeks passed. The seasons began to shift. One afternoon, as golden leaves fluttered outside the window, Nathan joined me in the garden. I used to think strength meant keeping the peace, he said, pruning a rose bush. Now I realize it means protecting what's right, even when it hurts. I smiled. Wisdom often grows from the ashes of our mistakes. He chuckled softly. You always speak like that, calm, wise, like you knew this would happen. I didn't, I admitted, but I knew who I was dealing with, and I trusted myself to face it. He looked at me for a long moment. You're incredible, Mother, truly. I squeezed his hand. I'm just a woman who loves her family enough to fight for it, in my own way. Later that evening, I sat in my study, the fireplace crackling gently. On the table beside me lay a single sheet of paper, my new will. I had rewritten it entirely, not out of spite, but clarity. Everything would now go to Nathan directly, with clear protections in place. No one would ever manipulate him again through me. James had helped me finalize it. He'd smiled when I signed the last page and said, You always did have a knack for strategy, Eleanor. I prefer to call it survival, I replied. That night, as I prepared for bed, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. There were new lines on my face, marks of time and battles fought quietly. But my eyes, they were as sharp as ever. Lydia underestimated me because of those lines, because of my age. But wisdom isn't weakness. It's armor. And in the end, that armor had saved us all. Morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, scattering gold across the sitting room. For the first time in months, the house felt like a home again. There was no tension in the air, no careful silences or hidden cruelties, only the hum of peace returning to its rightful place. Nathan sat across from me, a cup of coffee in hand. His posture was different now. No longer the slouched, hesitant son I'd watched wilt under manipulation. He carried a quiet strength, a steadiness that comes from surviving something that could have broken him. "I met with the lawyers this morning," he said. "The divorce papers are finalized. Lydia signed without contest." I nodded. "That's good." He hesitated. "She's leaving town. Moving somewhere up north, I heard. Said she needs a fresh start." There was a flicker of sadness in his voice, a faint ghost of love not yet fully gone. I understood it. Forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. "She'll find her path," I said softly. "We all do, eventually. But some roads are lonelier than others." He looked at me, eyes thoughtful. Do you hate her, Mother?" I smiled faintly. "Hate is a heavy thing, Nathan. I prefer to let people carry the weight of their own choices." He leaned back, silent for a moment. "I wish I'd seen her sooner. The manipulation, the lies. How did you see through it all?" I sipped my tea before answering. "Because I've lived long enough to recognize patterns, and because I listened more to what she didn't say than to what she did." Nathan chuckled softly. "You make it sound so simple." "It never is," I said, "but truth has a way of whispering, even through the noise of deceit." That afternoon, we walked through the garden together. The roses had begun to bloom again, stubborn, beautiful things that refused to wither despite the cold nights that had passed. "Do you remember," I said, "how your father used to prune these every spring?" Nathan smiled. "He used to say you could tell a person's character by how they tend to fragile things." "Your father was right," I said quietly. "And you? You've learned that lesson the hard way." He stopped walking. "Do you think I failed, Mother?" I turned to him. "No, darling, you stumbled. That's different. Failure is staying blind after being shown the truth. You didn't do that." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "You always know what to say." "I only speak what I've learned," I replied. "Age teaches you one thing above all else, that silence, when used wisely, is more powerful than shouting." Weeks passed, and with each one, Nathan seemed lighter. He spent time at his architecture firm again, began seeing friends he'd lost touch with during his marriage. The laughter that had been missing from his life, and from this house, returned in small, hesitant bursts. But there were moments, too, quiet ones, where I'd see him standing by the window, staring out at nothing. Those were the moments he was remembering, replaying words, gestures, nights when he'd mistaken manipulation for love. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he found me in the library. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you told me, about love blinding us." I closed the book in my lap. "And?" "I think I finally understand. Love without honesty isn't love. It's dependence." I smiled softly. "You've grown wiser than most men twice your age, Nathan." He laughed under his breath. I had a good teacher. A month later, the final letter arrived. From Lydia. It was short, written in her elegant cursive handwriting. Nathan, I'm sorry for how things ended. I did what I thought was best for me, perhaps selfishly so. I hope you and your mother find peace. L. Nathan read it once, then handed it to me. I don't know what to feel. I said, feel what comes. Anger, pity, indifference, they're all part of healing. What matters is that you don't let bitterness take root. That's what she would have wanted, for you to carry her in your resentment. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. No, I won't give her that. Good, I said. Then you've already won. In early spring, I invited a few friends over for tea. The laughter that filled the living room that day reminded me of the years before Lydia, the warmth, the light, the shared joy that had been missing for so long. Nathan joined us briefly, and I noticed how the women smiled approvingly when he entered. They whispered among themselves, as women do, about what a fine young man he was. Later, when they'd gone, I teased him gently. You have admirers? He rolled his eyes, but I saw the faintest blush. Please, Mother, not yet. I chuckled. When the time comes, you'll know. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Choose someone who doesn't need to win. Choose someone who understands partnership, not possession. He nodded solemnly. I will. As the months passed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. The scars Lydia left behind faded, not forgotten, but softened by time and understanding. Nathan's eyes no longer carried that clouded uncertainty. He spoke with confidence, made decisions without hesitation, and me, I found myself breathing easier, sleeping better. I'd reclaimed something more valuable than wealth, my peace of mind. One afternoon, I met with Mr. Harris in his office downtown. You did it, he said, pouring me a cup of coffee. I don't often see people handle situations like this with such grace. It wasn't grace, I said, smiling faintly. It was necessity. I couldn't fight her on her battlefield, deceit and manipulation. I had to build my own. He nodded approvingly. And you built it well. Nathan's lucky to have you. I looked out the window at the bustling city beyond. He won't need me forever. That's how it should be. But I'm glad I could protect him long enough for him to see the truth. Mr. Harris leaned back, studying me. Do you ever wonder what drives people like her? Fear, I said simply. They fear being ordinary. They fear losing control. And in trying to control everything, they lose what matters most. He smiled. You could write a book, Eleanor. I chuckled. Maybe one day. That evening, as I returned home, I stood by the garden gate and looked at the house, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. The same house where so much pain had unfolded, and where, slowly, healing had taken root. Nathan was inside, talking on the phone. His laughter, rich and genuine, floated through the open window. I smiled. It was the sound of renewal. I turned and walked back inside, the soft creak of the floorboards greeting me like an old friend. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the fire. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to watch, to plan, to guard. The game was over, and peace, hard-earned and honest, had returned. But before going to bed, I took out my old notebook, the one I'd once used to record Lydia's schemes. I flipped through its pages, each one filled with small notes, observations, moments of quiet resistance. And on the very last page, I wrote, "The greatest victory is not in exposing deceit, but in surviving it with your soul intact." I closed the book, placed it back in the drawer, and turned off the light. The air had changed again. It wasn't the tension of fear or the heaviness of grief. It was calm, like the stillness that follows a long and violent storm. The house, once filled with whispers and suspicion, now carried only the soft rhythm of ordinary days. I thought that would be the end of it, that Lydia would vanish into whatever corner of the world she chose to reinvent herself in. But deceit, I've learned, rarely disappears quietly. It leaves ripples, echoes that reach further than you expect. It was a Thursday morning when Mr. Harris called. His tone was measured, but beneath the professionalism, I could sense something weighty. "Eleanor," he began, "you might want to sit down." "I'm sitting," I replied. "There's been a development. Lydia attempted to liquidate some of Daniel's company assets using a falsified authorizations, old copies of his signature from shared accounts. The bank flagged it. She's now under investigation for fraud." I let out a long breath. She never could resist one last move, could she? "People like her," Mr. Harris said quietly, "don't stop until someone forces them to." I thought about that for a moment. Will she face charges? Yes, and this time the evidence is indisputable. There was a silence between us, not satisfaction, not gloating, just a quiet understanding that the wheel of consequence had finally completed its turn. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," I said, "for everything." He paused. "Eleanor, you did the hard part. You stayed patient. You let truth win the way it was meant to." After I hung up, I sat by the window and watched the morning sunlight spill across the lawn. It was the same light that had touched every season of my life. The light that had shone on love, betrayal, loss, and now renewal. Justice had come, not through vengeance, but through time and truth. The two forces that never fail when we trust them long enough. Nathan came by that evening. He looked composed, older somehow, though only months had passed. He had the look of a man who'd finally stepped into his own life without the shadow of another's control. He handed me a small envelope. "It's from the bank. Mr. Harris told me everything." I opened it. Inside was a formal statement confirming Lydia's attempt to access company funds, now frozen by court order. She'll face consequences. They're not pressing charges on my behalf, but the company is. It's out of my hands now. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "That's as it should be. You've done your part, by walking away." Nathan sighed, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel relieved, maybe even vindicated, but all I feel is tired." I smiled softly. "Justice isn't a celebration, Nathan. It's a correction." He nodded. "I keep thinking of the little moments, the mornings we'd have breakfast, her smile, the way she'd reach for my hand. Were they all lies?" I said gently, "Not all. Even manipulators are human, but every truth she gave you was wrapped in purpose. You saw what she wanted you to see." He leaned back, rubbing his temple. "I guess I needed to lose everything to see clearly." "You didn't lose everything. You lost illusion. That's not a tragedy. That's liberation." Weeks passed. Lydia's name became a brief headline in the business section of a local newspaper. "Socialite charged in fraud case." It was clinical, detached, almost forgettable. The world moved on quickly, as it always does. But for us, life was different, slower, more intentional. Nathan spent his weekends helping me restore the old greenhouse at the back of the property. It had fallen into disrepair during the chaos of the past year. Together, we scrubbed the glass, replanted the herbs, and let the smell of damp soil and rosemary fill the air. One afternoon, as we worked side by side, he said quietly, "You know, I used to think you were being unfair to her. I thought you just didn't want to let go." I smiled faintly. "And now?" "Now I realize you never held on out of control. You held on out of care." I looked at him, My son, the boy who once clung to my hand crossing the street, now a man rebuilding his own foundation. Every mother does. We don't fight because we like the battle. We fight because peace must be protected. He nodded, emotion thick in his voice. I don't deserve you. You do, I said softly. You always did. That night, after he'd gone home, I walked through the greenhouse alone. The moonlight filtered through the glass, silvering the leaves. I traced my fingers over the rough wood of the old workbench and thought of my late husband. He would have been proud of Nathan, of how he'd faced his mistakes, learned, and emerged wiser. He would have been proud of me, too, though I could almost hear his teasing voice. You always did know how to play chess with people, didn't you, Eleanor? I smiled to myself. Only when necessary, I whispered. A few months later, Nathan invited me to his firm's new project unveiling, a housing design focused on sustainability and family living. As I walked through the bright, airy model home, I saw his fingerprints everywhere. Balance, intention, heart. When the event ended, he came to stand beside me. Do you like it? I love it, I said. It feels like home. That's what I wanted. Not just a structure, but a feeling, something honest. I looked at him with pride. You have found your truth, Nathan. That's worth more than any inheritance. He smiled. You gave me both. That evening, I returned home and found an old photograph tucked into a drawer, one of Nathan as a child standing beside his father and me in front of this very house. His face was all laughter and sunlight, untouched by the shadows of adulthood. I slipped the photo into a frame and placed it on the mantel. Then I sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to guard, no schemes to unravel, no masks to watch for. Just life, quiet, unadorned, and real. Months later, I received a letter from Mr. Harris again. Eleanor, the case has been resolved. Lydia accepted a plea deal, restitution and probation. She's left the city permanently. I thought you'd want to know. I folded the letter and placed it in my notebook, the same one that had once held evidence of deceit. Now it held the story of survival. And on the final page, I wrote, Justice is not revenge. It is peace restored. And peace, once reclaimed, must be cherished as fiercely as it was fought for. Spring returned, bringing with it new blooms and the soft hum of life moving forward. Nathan visited often, not out of obligation, but love. Sometimes he brought flowers, sometimes just stories. We didn't talk about Lydia anymore. There was no need. She had become a lesson, not a wound. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the garden glowed in amber light, Nathan turned to me and said, Do you ever regret how it all happened? I thought for a moment. Regret, I said. No, but I do wish it hadn't been necessary. He nodded. I guess that's what wisdom is. Accepting what was necessary even when it hurt. I smiled. Exactly. We sat in silence after that, watching the light fade and the first stars appear. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The kind that only comes when everything that needed to be said has finally been spoken. That night, before bed, I stood by the window and looked out over the garden one last time. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, and the moon cast its silver blessing over everything we had endured and overcome. Life has a way of coming full circle, of testing us, breaking us, and then offering us the chance to rebuild. And, if I've learned anything in this long, unpredictable life, It's this. You cannot protect those you love from every wound, but you can make sure they never face them unprepared. That was my legacy. Not wealth, not property, but wisdom. Because sometimes the sharpest mind and the softest heart belong to the same woman. And that, I thought as I turned out the light, was enough.